So I'm incredibly excited to welcome Stasha Rhodes here today and Andy Gordon. Stasha Rhodes is the Executive Director of United for Democracy, a national coalition of 140 organizations representing tens of millions of Americans, shining a spotlight on the impact that the Supreme Court has on our freedoms and calling on Congress to fix the court. She also currently serves as a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where she helps lead the organization's work on democracy and government reform issues. Rhodes has more than 15 years of experience conducting state and national campaigns and building grassroots power to shape national conversations around critical policy principles, ranging from filibuster reform and DC statehood to gun violence prevention and reproductive rights. She currently sits on the board of the American Non-Smokers' Rights Foundation and Survivors Empowered. She is also an adjunct professor at Smith College in Massachusetts. So Andrew Gordon is a seasoned senior litigator with 45 years of experience and a national reputation in business, antitrust, healthcare law, government contracting, and procurement and appeals. He is also one of Arizona's best-known experts in election law, having represented a wide array of elected officials and campaigns, including former Arizona Governor Janet Napolitano, Phoenix Mayor Phil Gordon, and a number of initiative and referendum campaigns, which is also close to our hearts. He is also a judge pro tem on the Maricopa County Superior Court. So we have two very illustrious guests here. I think you can see. So let's get started. So first, Stasha, and maybe one of my team can spotlight Andy and Stasha also. First, Stasha, can you tell us a bit more about your background and what led you to this work? I think learning about people's personal journeys is just so revealing. So first you, and then Andy.
Well, Kathy, thank you so much for having me. Happy Sunday, everyone. I am honored to join all of you on a Sunday, right the day before the DNC, no less. So I'm super jazzed and grateful to be here to talk about the Supreme Court. And I also see my dear friend, Dr. Kathy. We worked together on this Supreme Court reform journey, so it's good to share space with you. And Dr. Scott. Dr. Scott's on here. Hi, Dr. Scott. Good to see you all. I'm always excited to join my friend from Arizona. It is worth noting before I say just a few words about my personal background that I spent a lot of time in Arizona. I worked for Gabby Giffords and Senator Mark Kelly on a number of gun violence prevention issues. And so I had the great fortune of spending time in Tucson and Phoenix as I worked with them. So good to be here tonight. I have been doing this work, as Kathy mentioned, for the past 15, 20 years, mostly an issue advocacy organizer. I have kind of been encouraged to do this work probably since I was 14. I stumbled upon a book that was written about my grandparents. They were sharecroppers in South Louisiana deep into the 70s. When most of America had kind of moved on from the sharecropping system, my grandparents were. And it was because of attorneys and organizers who traveled to Louisiana and kind of helped to work with the sharecroppers that my grandparents were able to lead a movement to dismantle the sharecropping system in Louisiana. They were able to sort of meet and work with Bobby Kennedy and meet the Pope and testify in Congress. And reading this book just inspired me to sort of prioritize making real change. I think I stumbled on democracy. It was not something that I initially thought that I would work on, but ultimately landed and have been working on democracy for the past 6 years because it is really the foundation of all the issues that we care about. If you care about reproductive freedom, if you care about gun violence prevention, if you care about education, then you have to also care about a functioning democracy. And so I've been kind of focused on democracy for those reasons because we we need a strong and true democracy to move the needle on all the priorities that we care about. So it's a pleasure to be here, and obviously, most importantly, it's good to be on here with my new friend, Andy Gordon.
Hi, I'm glad to be here on a Sunday. I see some old friends in the crowd. I've been involved litigating all kinds of election cases in front of every level of court in Arizona and the United States Supreme Court and in Ninth Circuit for 45 years. I've a practicing lawyer until very recently. In addition to that, I spent a couple of years in the early 90s during the Clinton administration working on Capitol Hill. Worked at the Department of Homeland Security during the first 2 years of the Biden administration, where I worked on a case near and dear to, I think, all of our hearts, SB 1070, and getting what was then a more balanced Supreme Court to recognize the unconstitutionality of that act. Have argued any number of cases to the Arizona Supreme Court. For those of you who have been in Arizona long enough, argued the recall case involving Evan Beacom to the Supreme Court. More recently, the attempts of then Governor Brewer to disrupt the independent redistricting commission and remove the commissioner she was at odds with. And in addition, I teach at Arizona State University's law school. It's just a long-winded way of saying I've been at this a really long time and worn lots of different hats. It's a real honor to be able to talk to you, and it's great to make a new friend with Stasha.
Mm-hmm. Great. So we're going to dive right into both the U.S. Supreme Court and the Arizona state courts, and we'll definitely be seeing some common themes about the judiciary and the types of decisions, as well as some of the cases that are currently in front of the courts. So I want to start with a broadly contextual question, which is, are the courts already politicized? And has there been a time in history when they weren't? I mean, what does it mean also to pack the courts? Stasha, could you maybe start that off?
I think, Larry Kramer, who's the former dean of Stanford Law School and is now the president of the Packard Foundation, wrote a little bit about this and said that our founding fathers have talked a lot about the fact that Supreme Court decisions were almost inextricable from politics. And so I think it's safe to say that the court probably has always been some version of political. But I also think that it is safe to say none more political or brazen as the current Supreme Court majority that we're seeing. Whether we're talking about this Supreme Court overturning long-standing precedent with no real legal merit, or ignoring long-standing judicial norms, or we're talking about the Supreme Court justices individually flying upside down flags in support of overturning elections, or receiving obscene gifts like Clarence Thomas and flying on jets and getting his mother's home paid for, or his wife's role in the insurrection on January 6th. This court is deeply political and really hasn't been afraid to sort of lean into some of the most political antics that I think we've seen in our time. I think another thing about this court is that we've seen probably for the past 40 to 50 years a really active judicial movement on the right to capture our federal courts. And so they've been really political in how they plan to capture our federal courts. They've not been shy about saying that to protect babies from abortion or to save traditional marriage, that you needed to elect members of Congress that were going to appoint the right justices. The movement to capture our federal court has been overtly political. as most recently as President Trump saying that he was going to appoint members to this court to ensure that they were going to overturn Roe. And so I don't think it is a wildly polarizing thing to say that this court has been seriously political.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, look, cases get to the Supreme Court because there's some policy issue underlying it. And so on any level, there's some political philosophy that's going to come into play. It's just that the folks on the Supreme Court now, particularly Thomas and Alito, but Roberts and the rest can be just as bad, are just remarkably overtly political. And it really does contrast with what we've had the last number of decades in Arizona. We'll get to this later on, but among the major cases I've argued to the Arizona Supreme Court, they have involved justices appointed by Republican governors voting against the position of the then empowered Republican governors. They have enough independence to look at it fairly. And it's a stark contrast, I think, to what's going on with the United States Supreme Court. That's why when we get down to talking about Prop 137, it's such an important effort by the far right as part of the longstanding Federalist Society, where Stasha is talking about, to politicize our courts to the extent the U.S. Supreme Court has become politicized.
Mhm. Yeah, and just to clarify, Prop 137 is going to be on the, presumably, I believe litigation is still ongoing, but it will be on the ballot this fall to eliminate our judicial retention elections, which are part of the merit system that we have had in place since the 1970s. So we will talk a bit more about that later. So I'm still interested in how the judiciary is supposed to either reflect or not, the majority of the people in our country. And I think this is so interesting because, if you think of civil rights litigation, for example, or legislation, there Brown versus Board. I mean, there have definitely been some Supreme Court cases that have led the country rather than followed the country. And so that's why I'm sort of wondering about your thoughts. Is the judiciary supposed to reflect the population or lead the population in some direction? Stasha?
Yeah, I'll start, but I think Andy might have probably a more thoughtful take on this. I don't know if we have the perfect answer. I don't know if this answer exists. And I'm seriously curious about Andy's take here, but this for me brings up two main things. It highlights, I think, two big pieces. The first is the fact that the power to set government policy overall has become increasingly disconnected from public opinion, which makes us much less of a democracy. 2 of the past 4 presidents have taken office despite losing the popular vote. U.S. senators representing a majority of Americans are finding it hard to pass bills, partly because of the filibuster. And even the U.S. House, the body that was intended to most reflect the popular will, cannot always function in that way because of the way that the districts are drawn. Of course, the Supreme Court highlights this disconnect as well, and sort of thinking about the fact that although the Democratic Party has won the popular vote in 7 of the past 8 presidential elections, this Supreme Court is dominated by Republican appointees who are drastically reshaping American politics for decades. I think the extreme conservative Supreme Court majorities for the past 20 years have lurched this country's laws to the right on guns, voting, gerrymandering, regulatory authority, unions, all against popular will. So the second thing that this raises for me is the idea that the left does not have a clear vision on the Constitution. The right is in the middle of a conservative legal revolution powered by their version of fake originalism. And the left has lost anything that would animate a positive, forward-thinking theory of what the Constitution really is and how the Supreme Court should judge in a modern society. And I think that's important. We need a sort of shared vision or a shared expectation for how a court operates in 2025. I think I'll say just one final thing. A really incredible judicial scholar said to me that imagine if we were shaping the Constitution for the year 2035, that today we would draft that Constitution and the folks in year 2035 would then have to live with what we decide, not 2035, 3025. They would have to be sort of deal with our Constitution that we've drafted for them. We don't know their economy. We don't know national security. We don't know technology. Yet our Constitution would have to live for folks in 3025, and that's sort of what we're dealing with. The right's done a really good messaging job in galvanizing their base around what they have claimed to be originalism. I think a number of folks would say that their version of originalism isn't really true. We on the left haven't done a really good job of having more of a forward-thinking approach on how this court should operate and what's our constitutional theory of the case.
Yeah, on the question of whether the court should lead or reflect popular opinion or get drug along by popular opinion, I think all three happen.
Yeah.
Brown versus Board of Education is one of the great examples of the court leading when Congress was unwilling to do that. Dobbs is a great example of the court acting way against the public will, overwhelmingly. I mean, not only is it legally just trash as an opinion, but against the public will. Now, the flip is in the 1930s, when a very conservative Republican court was throwing out FDR's New Deal program right and left, and there was a greater and greater and greater groundswell, the court finally backed away in light of public sentiment. I don't see that happening. Certainly, I don't see that happening with Thomas Alito. But the court has done all these things. And what Stasha says about, particularly out of what I refer to as the Federalist Society, which is a highly well-funded right-wing effort over decades to take over the court, they've seized on this so-called originalism, which is terrible legal theory, terrible history, but they have been very strategic in placing their people on the court. But in terms of what does the court reflect, it's been everywhere, to be honest, and obviously we would like it to move, I should use my left hand, back to the more progressive side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I always say that, they believe in originalism except when they don't,
Right.
so, it seems to go both ways. So, to sort of wrap up this sort of discussion, general discussion. So the job of a judge, is both to read the law and also interpret the law. And that to me is really where it opens the door to is, a judge's opinion, rather than just following the law. So how far should that interpretation go? And in concrete terms, can you think of cases where justices have created a completely new interpretation or completely new legal theory out of whole cloth, outside of the law, but still they indicate that they are interpreting the law? So how far does interpretation go, I guess, is my question. Yeah.
Well, what I was writing down here to my left, several years ago, the Supreme Court came up with what's called the major questions doctrine. And not to sound too much like a lawyer and a law professor, but that's what I am. Over the last 100 years or so, the court has been deferential to administrative agencies that have expertise in an area as to their vision of what that agency should be able to do, whether it's the EPA or the Defense Department, any number of agencies, my old agency, the Department of Homeland Security. Well, the right has fought the so-called administrative government for decades, and Justice Roberts essentially came up with this doctrine that says, look, forget what we've said for the last 100 years. If the administrative agency is doing something that is really big, which administrative agencies do and are supposed to do, if it is a, quote, major question, then the statute in creating that agency has to explicitly set forth that the agency has this power. Now, most of these agencies were created in the teens and 20s and 30s. Federal Trade Commission, for instance, which is one I deal with all the time and is really doing some very dynamic and exciting things now. Under this new doctrine, and it is entirely new. They just made it up. Okay. And Stasha, I think, are going to talk about what's called the Chevron doctrine, and the two of these kind of go hand in hand. Has the impact, the capacity to impact our lives in hugely negative ways, particularly with climate change. If the court is permitted to do these things, it is going to be very difficult, not just to be progressive on climate change, to do anything on climate change. So yeah, they do it, and there's one example.
Yeah. I mean, you are singing my tune, particularly with regard to the Chevron decision and, Chevron deference, and really the power or the need for regulatory agencies to, safeguard our health, our safety, everything that benefits the public. But this also leads me, and Stasha, this is for you. The court seems to be grabbing power for itself, and the Chevron doctrine is an example, a huge example of the court really injecting itself into a process that needs expertise, needs, people who really know what they're talking about, rather than it's really not a legal issue to determine, something complex about chemicals. But how are the courts, or how is the Supreme Court specifically grabbing power for itself? Take it away. You're muted.
One of these days, I'll be more consistent with Zoom. I was saying that I don't know if we have enough time to talk about how the Supreme Court's taking power. So as Andy, I think, just beautifully talked about, I'll say a few more words. But in the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling in Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, they dealt a very severe blow to the ability of federal agencies to do their jobs by ending the 40-year-old precedent of Chevron deference. So instead of deferring to the expertise of agencies on how to interpret ambiguous language in laws pertaining to their work, federal judges now have the power to decide what a law means for themselves. As a result, despite not being accountable to the people, judges will now be able to expand their role in a realm of never-ending policymaking. Justice, I think Elena Kagan said, in one fell swoop, the majority today gives itself exclusive power over every open issue, no matter how expertise-driven or policy-laden, involving the meaning of regulatory law. And so this decision will have profound consequences, not only for the country's rule of law, but also for how agencies, such as those protecting the public against pollution or contaminated food in the workplace. This is really important, even though for many folks it sounds sleepy, you know? But the fact that this court is going to legally be able to interfere in policymaking is incredibly important, because on whose behalf are they making this policy? And I think that's going to be an important question. But the fact that this is so devastating is true, but it isn't new. The Supreme Court has been using its power to make decisions on a range of policy issues that should be left to Congress and the executive branch, from clean water regulation to healthcare, voting rights, guns. They have been undermining our system of checks and balances to reshape our country according to their right-wing agenda. We've been telling folks for a while that they have to pay attention to this case, to this sort of string of cases that started to chip away at policymaking and deference. We called our campaign the Stop the Relentless Power Grab, in order to really call attention to this. And we want Americans to know that from pollution in the water we drink to safety in our communities to our most personal healthcare decisions, the Supreme Court is exercising power over every part of our lives, even when we can't see it. And we like to think of the Supreme Court as this sort of unbiased branch of government off doing the thing that's going to save us. But today, the Supreme Court is more biased, corrupt, and now way too powerful. And it has been removing our freedoms and radically reshaping our country to further their agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Andy, what are your thoughts about the?
Yeah, let me add,
and
you know, there's always the joke about the great lie. Well, the really great lie was when Justice Roberts said, we don't make policy, I just call balls and strikes.
yeah,
That is just absolute total nonsense. And they can't just call balls and strikes, because oftentimes laws that get to them aren't clear or didn't contemplate a particular set of circumstances. I mean, they're there to work this out, but there has been, since the beginning of the country, kind of a set of rules and ways we interpret statutes to work through all that. That's why this notion of stare decisis, you know, sort of following the law as it evolves over time, whether you like it or not, as a justice is so so important. And the current court has no compunction about forgetting all of that. I mean, there are many Justice Thomas opinions where I know this is really wonky lawyer professor stuff, I'm sorry, but there are many Clarence Thomas decisions where the only thing he cites are his dissents in prior cases, you know, and that somehow becomes the precedent for what they're doing. And what they're also really taking advantage of, look, it's happened in the past. It happened with the laws involving the Equal Opportunity Commission, where the Supreme Court struck down some part of the law or didn't interpret it. And we had a functioning Congress, and Congress would go back in and change the law. And that happened a lot. But now we don't have a functioning Congress. And haven't really, because of what Stasha referred to, uh, before, with the filibuster, we haven't had a really functioning Congress in quite a while, even when one party has control. So, and they know that, and they're taking advantage of it.
Mm-hmm. Andy, what can you sort of extend this discussion to the courts in Arizona? I mean, do you feel that the Arizona courts are also sort of leaning in that direction in terms of assuming power for themselves?
Not yet. Yeah, yes, I can do it.
Yeah.
uh, uh, let let me explain for a couple of minutes the difference between how the federal judiciary is appointed and works and what we have in Arizona. Under the United States Constitution, federal judges, whether they're district court judges, appellate judges, or Supreme Court justices, are nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and serve for life. There's only one or two exceptions, I think, maybe three, where justices or judges have been removed through impeachment. But the only way you get rid of a federal judge is impeached. They serve life terms. Now, there's a lot written now about doing away with that or changing it, but that's the federal process, and the people never have any direct role in it. In the early 1970s, Arizona adopted a judicial appointment system where there is a commission in which there are no legislators, nor the governor's office, who, when there is an opening on an Arizona court, whether it's our trial court or what's called a Superior Court, Court of Appeals, or our Supreme Court, will nominate to the governor a list of at least 3 different people to fill that vacancy. And then that judge or justice has to stand for retention, yet he or she has to stand for retention at the first general election following their appointment, and then depending upon what level of judge there are, again, every 4 or 6 years, and the people get to vote on whether to keep them or not. Now, just imagine if there was a popular vote in the United States to keep Justice Alito or Thomas. My hunch is they'd face real uphill battles. Okay? The result of that, the result of both how the people are selected and how they're retained, gives, I think, it's not that I don't disagree with their opinions. Sometimes I'm going to talk about one of them in a moment. But I do think it gives more independence and more accountability. As I said, a couple of years ago, well, more than a couple now, we had a very significant case involving our independent redistricting commission, and the governor wanted to remove the chair of the committee. It went to the Arizona Supreme Court. The Arizona Supreme Court at that point was only 5 justices, 3 of whom had been appointed by Republicans, and yet they unanimously ruled against the governor. And I think that's a huge difference between the federal system and the state system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Stasha first, what is a case that SCOTUS has decided that, in your opinion, is incredibly unjust and was wrongly decided? And Andy, then you with the Arizona Supreme Court.
I feel like I'm answering these questions very political by not really answering them. It is not because I'm trying to dodge them, but this is a very complicated Supreme Court. It is hard for me to select one case that I think is the most unjust. I think that this Supreme Court has been handing us a consistent grouping of unfairly decided, unjust cases that impact the American people in a number of different ways. As I mentioned, there've been some serious decisions that have rolled back progress on gun violence prevention, in things like the Bruin decision. I cannot overstate the impact of overturning Roe versus Wade. I can't overstate them chipping away at the Chevron deference and overturning that agency authority. And so I guess I would say the most unjust thing about this court is that they are ignoring longstanding precedent and ignoring the Constitution in order to further their agenda. And most importantly, these things are touching people in real ways. These are not esoteric legal theories that one day will land in a law book and then we won't hear about them again. These are decisions that are impacting us daily, some sooner than others, but all of them having massive impact on the way that we live and sort of the way that we think about American life generally. So it's hard for me to select one as the most unjust. I will say Roberts has a particular interest in rolling back voting rights. I think voting rights is important because it's so deeply connected to democracy, and democracy is undergirding all of these issues that we care about. And so hampering our ability or hindering our ability to really ensure that we are participating in free and fair elections makes it more difficult for us to make America more democratic and democratize the Supreme Court and fix the Senate and do all of those things. And so if I had to pick one, I think it would be what Roberts has been doing to voting rights through Shelby and a number of other different cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely sympathize with the feeling that it is hard to figure out just one because there are so many. Andy.
Yeah, so I don't have the hesitation or doubt that Stasha has. In my mind, the Arizona Supreme Court's recent Planned Parenthood decision, let me give a little background in a moment, putting into place the 1864 ban on abortion is without question the worst decision. Actually, it's the worst decision I can think of since I came to Arizona in 1973. When the US Supreme Court tossed out Roe v. Wade and Dobbs, then the question became, what could states do or state legislators do? And there was a series of laws that have been enacted in anticipation of that. Arizona had one of those. And then the right wing argued, well, actually, the law in Arizona that should apply is an 1864 total absolute ban on abortion. And the Court of Appeals said, no, for a lot of now, to be honest, my law firm was in there arguing it for Planned Parenthood, but no, there's a lot of reasons why that 1864 law shouldn't come into effect. And the Supreme Court reversed that and said, no, with two dissenters, the 1864 law, a law passed at the time, not only that that slavery still existed, at least in a good part of the country, but women didn't have the right to vote. I mean, there was any number of misogynistic, racist reasons behind this law. And through our Attorney General, Chris Mays's efforts, we were able to kind of push that down the road. And now we've got a very progressive pro-choice initiative that's going to be on the ballot, which all of you should vote for. Excuse me. And if it had been allowed to go into place, let me just make Stasha's point really clear. People die because of these opinions. People die. Women die. And let me give just a little more background. For years, the Arizona Supreme Court was made up of 5 justices. When the prior Republican governor was leaving office, Doug Ducey, Ducey got his legislature to expand the court by 2 justices to 7. So because he wasn't getting the majority he wanted, and then he put 2 of these very federalist type people on the Arizona Supreme Court, and they were part of the majority that wanted to keep in effect this 1864 ban. And to kind of jump ahead in the story, those 2 justices are on the ballot this fall for retention or not. It's Justices Bollock and King, in case there's any questions about who I'm talking about. And now the legislature wants to take that right to retain away. I know that's kind of a rambling answer, weaving a bunch of stuff together, but yeah.
No,
I don't have any doubt what the worst decision is.
yeah, I appreciate that very much, particularly sort of bringing these decisions down to earth. I mean, because they may sound like legal theory, but in fact, these are profoundly impactful for, justice, for voting, for, life and death, for the sort of regulations that protect us as a society. I definitely understand. One of the questions that's come up in the chat that I think people are very concerned about is the presidential immunity decision, which seems to me made up out of whole cloth. So, what are your thoughts about that? Either Stasha or Andy, whoever wants to answer that.
Well, it's a terrible decision. Although it's interesting, Kathy, to be fair, from a couple of reasons. So here's the question that has never before been directly addressed by the Supreme Court, and that is the extent to which a former president can be indicted and convicted of crimes that he or she allegedly committed during their presidency, and to what extent should he or she be exposed to criminal activity, criminal prosecution. There actually isn't a US Supreme Court case or statute directly on that point. In this case, the Supreme Court wrote an opinion so broadly protecting a president that I think it's going to make it very difficult to convict former President Trump. But it will be interesting because it's a long and complex decision, and it's going back to first to a district judge who I think will take the narrowest possible view of that opinion, and then it'll go to the DC Circuit, which is the Court of Appeals of the District of Columbia. And so it's really a little hard to tell how it'll play out in my mind. I don't think it'll play out well, but hopefully he won't be in a position to pardon himself and make it all moot anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have much to add, just that from, going back to your first question, Kathy, is the Supreme Court political? And I think there's probably no other case that will highlight the extent to which this court will go to uplift the Republican Party, even Donald Trump. This is an incredibly bizarre decision. It is not rooted in any legal theory or the Constitution. And so much so, there's one benefit to this decision. This decision is so bad, it is so bizarre, that even President Biden had to come out in favor of reforming the US Supreme Court, something that he has been seriously hesitant to do for so many years. For those of you who know the president well, he's the chief institutionalist. He does not take lightly to reforms, and especially not structural reforms. But this ruling, this immunity decision, was so bizarre and so deeply threatening to American democracy that the president has come out in favor of reforms to the Supreme Court that included specifically rolling back this decision.
Yeah. Now, I wanted so badly to talk about the Federalist Society and Leonard Leo and everything, but that I think would take us at least another hour. So sadly, I think I'm going to move on beyond that. Andy, before we get to possible solutions, how do we unpack the court? And more importantly, what can we do as people to help? Could you talk about Prop 137 and, how it endangers, the accountability that we need from our judiciary here in Arizona? I'd just like you to sort of put a point on that.
Yeah, let me try and do this as quickly and simply as I can. As I said, in the early 1970s, Justice O'Connor, who was then not on the Supreme Court, led an effort to try and take the politics out of judicial selection. Up until that time, people just ran for judge the way they would for any other office. And some of us I know on this call were in Arizona for that, and it was ugly and corrupt and terrible. And so we created the Judicial Performance Commission, Review Commission. And as I said earlier, in Arizona, what happens when there's an opening on a court, either at the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, or any county where there's more than 250,000 people, which are Pima County, Maricopa County, Pinell, I'm not sure which other counties. Coconino are the only other counties. And this independently appointed commission will take applications and review them and then send to the governor for appointment a list of between 3 and 5 people for that particular opening. And then the governor has to select from that group. Something that really annoyed Governor Meekum. I remember that very vividly because I was sort of in the middle of that battle. And then, depending upon the level of the court, that judge or justice stands for retention. Well, when they're first appointed at the next general election, and thereafter either at 4 or 6 year intervals, and the commission goes through, looks at certain performance criteria, and it makes its recommendations. But the people get a vote for or against the judge or justice for any reason they want. The people ultimately get to decide. We haven't removed a lot of judges along the way. We've removed a few. My view, we should have removed a few more, but that's probably just licking my wounds from cases I lost. Prop 137 wants to take that right away from the people. And it is going to say that for any judge who is on the court, including those now, so it's going to act retroactively, that judge will serve until the mandatory retirement age of 70, except under certain very specific delineated reasons, that they're convicted of felony, they've got bankruptcy, a couple of more, and in those cases, only those judges will then have to stand for retention. The remaining judges just serve until the end. As if that was not bad enough, and that certainly, in my view, is bad enough, the legislature will now get to put the majority of the legislature, at least right now in Arizona, read Republican, although they don't have very big majorities in either house. We'll also get to put two people on the commission, which they've never had before, and which runs directly contrary to the notion of taking politics out of it. And then to really the icing on the cake is it also says that because this was going to be on the ballot in November, the justices and judges who are up for retention, even if they're voted out of office in the November election, it won't count. So if, for instance, hypothetically, Justices Bollock and King lose their retention election, they'll still be on the vote because this thing voids the November election. It is just outrageous.
Yeah, so vote against 137, I
Yeah.
think is the
Yeah.
no on 137. So I know it's not nearly enough time to talk about solutions, but I do know that your relentless campaign does involve, I mean, there are actions that we can take. And I would love to hear what some of those might be. We've already talked about one Arizona, opportunity, which is to vote no on 137. But what can we as individuals, I mean, our people are raring to do something and to make a difference. So, Stasha, what can we do?
Someone, I think it was Ian in the comments that said I smiled. I'm always excited about action. Like that's I'm just super excited. I will say that I have a lot of actions, and I was looking at time to try to figure out how I might make them quick. And then I also have this thought, Kathy, I promise I'm going to get to them, but I also have this thought of like, I want to phone a friend. There are some friends who are working in Arizona with United for Democracy who are on the doors, who are meeting with people, who are organizing events. And I'm just going to phone my friends and tell them to drop dates, things, actions, whatever you want in the chat. Because we are doing some incredible work with Jen Mandelblad and Kathy Patterson and Dr. Janice Scott, are just incredible coalition of people doing amazing work. So I want to make sure that you're highlighting those things in the chat. But I'll be fast. I tried to narrow it down to 3 things. Number 1, visit unitedfordemocracy.us and put your information in so that you can stay informed on what's happening with the Supreme Court. That is number 1. unitedfordemocracy.us. Thank you, Kathy. Do that, drop your information in ASAP. And number 2, I know this is a kind of like an obvious thing that everyone on this call is going to do, but I'm just going to say it out loud. The Supreme Court is on the ballot in November. I know we think that candidates are on the ballot. The Supreme Court is on the ballot, and our ability to reshape the Supreme Court and take it back from the extreme right is on the ballot. And so this is a 2-part, even though I'm kind of squeezing it into my second thing. Obviously, vote for the right candidates. But in order to do that, you have to make sure you're asking candidates what they're going to do to reshape this Supreme Court. And so please make the Supreme Court a voting issue. So when you're meeting with Gallego or other folks, make sure you're talking to them about what they're going to do for the Supreme Court and then vote accordingly. That's number 2. Number three, we're no longer asking people to just vote and forget about it. Once our folks are elected, we have to hold them accountable and immediately say, hey, it's time for us to reform the Supreme Court. It's time, pick up the phone, call your member of Congress and say, I'm glad you're elected. I elected you because I was concerned about this Supreme Court. I am so happy you won because I am counting on you to reform the Supreme Court. We will, United for Democracy and a number of other folks, should we win, we're going to have serious actions in the first 100 days that folks are going to be able to plug in. But one of the first things you can do immediately is to call them and say it's time to reform the Supreme Court. So those are my three things. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you. I'm so happy that we're investing in Arizona and that we have some amazing folks on the ground doing work there every day.
Ah, that is great. Andy, did you have something to add?
No, Stasha, I mean, we need a Congress that will reform the Supreme Court. And part of that undoubtedly means a Congress, read Senate, that's willing, at least on this issue, to get rid of the damn filibuster.
Mm-hmm.
I think Andy and I are going to be friends for a long time. Get rid of the filibuster. I want to, this is the last thing, Kathy, I promise.
No, that is fine.
So structural reforms are so not sexy, right? They're not the things people are talking about on the news. They're talking about the economy. They're talking about abortion. They're talking about immigration. Here's the important piece. Unless we're able to eliminate the filibuster and fix the Supreme Court, we can't see change on any of those things. And so we have to make sure when we're asking our members about any of those issues, we're also talking about the filibuster and the Supreme Court too. I promise that was my last thing, but I just wanted to highlight Andy's great point.
Oh, and I mean that you are so singing my tune about holding our politicians accountable after the election. We absolutely cannot just say, okay, job done, assuming we've elected the right people. We have to hold them accountable and we have to stay engaged. So thank you both so much. This has been my favorite event in ever. So, and don't forget to watch. Yeah. No, this is as many of you know, CEBV publishes Gavel Watch. We are in the final stages of preparation. So we do provide a guide to the judges on your ballot. And it has just annoyed me so much that the legislature put Prop 137 on the ballot by basically saying, well, you people just don't worry your little heads about the judiciary. We'll take care of it. And nothing could be farther from the truth and nothing could be farther from what any of us stand for. So thank you both so much. And we will release this recording and hope you will spread it far and wide. So thank you all very much. And we will all stay in touch and keep working. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.